This is looking at the Ted Hughes poem, Bayonet Charge. And I'm going to assume that you've read the poem and you've got a basic understanding of what it means on a sort of line by line basis. If you don't, or if you haven't, you can get a copy of the poem online and you can get that summary fairly straightforwardly by a bit of Googling. Reason for looking at it today is kind of multifaceted. We've got some students who will be looking at it as a poem in isolation, so writing about it as Bayonet Charge, just by itself. Some who would be doing it as an exercise for detailed analysis, taking out certain quotations and really pulling them apart. And then others who are doing it as a comparison poem with one of the others in an anthology, normally for GCSE. I'm going to kind of bear all of those in mind, but generally I'm going to try and explain this in terms that would get you the top grades in whichever exam you're sitting. Okay, so looking at it then, you can see I've got some bullet points at the top, and apologies for the handwriting, but talking you through these ideas, I would always start by making sure you've got clear in your head the overview of a poem story, the ideas and progression, thinking in slightly informal terms, what's the point, although obviously you'd explain that in a more formal way, and then considering what you're doing with the poem. So my initial thoughts here would be that my introduction would contain something like Hughes uses this third person account of the experience of a soldier and during the heat of battle or during the moment of attack, and the soldier's realization that the reality of the attack is very different from his principles or idealization of what he thought war was going to be. Then I'd move on to thinking about the ideas and how it progresses. It opens with a metaphorical awakening. That at first line of suddenly he awoke, he's not waking up from sleep, he's awakening to reality. So it opens with metaphorical awakening as the soldier realizes the reality of his position. And the poem moves from that action to an exploration, or through the exploration of the principles that drove him there. His, I suppose, wondering, or his, I can't think of the word, thinking of what actually led to him being there, an examination, a critical examination of his ideals. And then the ending, the poem concludes with this defining imperative that he needs to get out of there as soon as possible. Why would Hughes have written it? Well, we're going to sound tentative and exploratory because we don't know exactly why Hughes set out to do this, but we can suggest that the juxtaposition of the jingoism and the propaganda of the war machine is put against the reality of the individual's experience to question the kind of point of war, the meaning of war, the damage it does and the consequences. You may also be looking at using this poem to compare against another one, looking at the impact on the natural world or the presentation of nature. So just bearing in mind that that's a kind of thought as well. Just use the word jingoism. Jingoism is where you are kind of really over the top in terms of your patriotism. To be a patriot is to love your country. Patriotism is the love of your country. Jingoism is all that kind of slogan and propaganda stuff that goes with being very kind of gung-ho about that love of country. So looking at the poem then, first of all, I would look at the title. Obviously, a bayonet is one of those nasty weapons, which is a gun with a big sword, a big blade on the end. So it's a kind of multi-purpose weapon. It allows a soldier to ideally keep distance from his target. So, you can kill at a distance, and therefore, in some ways, we can maintain the emotional distance from the act of killing. But also, sadly, a bayonet, because it's got that blade on it, it allows the kind of up close, personal, the intimate aggression. If you're near enough to somebody to have to use that, then you are actually stabbing them. So, it's that idea that ideally it's allowing the emotional distance, and yet, practically speaking, often it is a very kind of personal, very kind of paradoxically intimate act. I say paradoxical because it kind of doesn't really add up. It doesn't make sense. Killing someone isn't intimate, and yet it is. You're there ending their life. The idea of a charge, especially those of you who are doing charge of the Light Brigade, you'll know it's that kind of aggression, it's that attack, it's very active. The idea here is this is a bayonet charge, and yet actually his action is all directed towards kind of wanting to be somewhere else, wanting to run away. So we look at the opening stanza, and it begins in Medea res. That means it opens in the middle of the action, and we have that suddenly he awoke. I've already said it's a metaphorical awakening, and I've given you some words down here. That is an N, okay? It's an epiphany, that kind of revelation, a metaphorical awakening, that idea of, he comes to his senses as he is across the battlefield. The soldier is unnamed and therefore becomes more of a universal symbol for all soldiers. Like, this is one man who is standing for many men. So he awoke and was running, raw in raw seamed khaki being that kind of heavy camouflage, kind of military material. And if you look at the caesura, we've got a lot of caesura, a lot of end stops. Okay, I think I've said, look at the sentence length up here. This first sentence starts here and it doesn't end until, some way into the second stanza. And it is punctuated with end stops and caesura. We've got these multiple clauses giving you that cumulative effect of this is happening and this is happening and this is happening. The line, or the sentence length rather, is adding to that feeling of overwhelming sensation, the idea of kind of being attacked on all sides. So we have the sensation leading from the caesura. He's running raw in raw seamed khaki. Seam is the join on the material. His uniform is causing injury. If you talk about different types of raw, and I've got this idea here. In fact, if I change color, you can probably see the additional annotation more clearly as it goes in. So if we look over here, raw, one of the things you can do is, to be sore or injured. If you rub something raw, you are rubbing it until it's all chafed or blistered or split. Okay. But also raw can mean unrefined, we use it to mean uncooked. So it can also mean metaphorically untrained or innocent. He is raw. He's raw because he's tender, both in his kind of flesh, because we are, delicate organic beings. But he's also raw because arguably he's a new recruit. He's inexperienced. He's got his raw seamed uniform. The uniform is rough and ready. It's unrefined. And I'd argue here that, it's part of this growing pattern in the poem of images of juxtaposing his body and his weaponry and blurring the line between the two. His weapons are meant to help him, but actually often they're impeding him. His body is meant to help him, but often he's impeding him. There's meant to be a kind of unity between the two, a good soldier and his kind of being at one with his weapon, and yet actually he's not. There's, I think, this kind of pattern of blurring lines and distinctions between him and his weapon that culminates in the final line of the poem. And we can talk about that in a moment. But really, if you're looking for that, it might be, if you're looking at the poem as a whole, that you choose to pick out that as a progression of the imagery as you go through. That would be a kind of good grade 9 point if you're looking at kind of how those ideas develop. But just for now, we've got his uniforms acting against him. His sweat is heavy. So, weighing him down is the anxiety and the feelings and the fear that are making him sweat, as well as that kind of, sensation that he's feeling. Stumbling across a field of clods. Clods are big lumps of earth, and stumbling is at odds with, or is contrasting against, that idea of the charge. This is meant to be a purposeful, direct, almost graceful thing. And he's not, he's falling all over the place about this uneven earth. We've got the assonance on the and the there, assonance being repetition of a vowel sound. And, he's running towards something which should really form a natural sanctuary. We're using now the language of nature, and nature is usually positive. This green hedge dazzles those connotations of, light and beauty and attraction, but it dazzles with rifle fire. So, the idea that nature has been taken and given this twist with the violence. If you're writing about the impact of conflict, it's the distorting effect on the natural world as well as the consequences for the individuals. So, these things that should be beautiful are actually kind of unpleasant. And he's hearing, and I'd argue the enjambment there. So, we know that we go on to the next line, but the combination of the enjambment and the line break mean that we have this sense of anticipation here from that white space. What's he hearing? He's hearing bullets. And we go from that kind of sense of, well, what is there? What's to follow, the sense of anticipation, to the onomatopoeia and the plosives of bullets smacking the belly out of the air. We've got the personification of the air and the idea of the violence and injury. The idea of attack and danger, it's pervasive, it's everywhere. There is no escaping it when even the air is having the innards ripped out of itself. Plosive alliteration is obviously P's, B's, and D's, that kind of explosive thing. I go for the onomatopoeia on smack. Again, we have that end stop and the dash there leading on to, well, what's his reaction? He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. Again, I'd pick up on the assonance there being clumsy. It's reflecting his effort, his heavy breathing, that sound. And, he's not carrying his rifle, he's lugging it. The connotations of lugged are very different. And his own rifle isn't, doing this firing. It is numb as a smashed arm. And similarly there, his rifle is a hindrance. His rifle is a problem. It's like he had this additional limb in this simile, but it's now useless. He's already kind of metaphorically injured because he can't operate all of his body parts anymore. Again, it's part of that body weapon pattern I mentioned earlier. We then have, again, this other end stop, and we're piling the ideas on, physically, this isn't working out. Training wise, this isn't working out. And now what's happened? Well, the patriotic tear that had past tense no longer, this is gone. It had brimmed in his eye. It had welled up, sweating like molten iron from the center of his chest. So the patriotic tear, that kind of strong sense of emotion for love of country, has now become this kind of leaden feeling at his very heart. And usually kind of imagery regarding, the heart and patriotism is a positive thing. But here it's strangely reminiscent of, the bullets and the iron in the air and these things firing, at him, smacking the belly out. And his sweat is like molten iron. This is the language of violence and pain and danger and threat. You may have noticed there's this little hypalage there, fancy little technique. It's where you have, it's almost kind of personification, right? The tear isn't being personified completely as patriotic. He was patriotic when he was crying the tear. So that's hypalage. You'd get away with saying personification, to be honest, or that it's mimicking his feelings. But hypalage is that where you have an adjective on a noun, and the adjective is describing the feelings of the person who's being talked about rather than the noun that's being talked about, if that makes sense. Okay, so we have that sweating like molten iron from the center of his chest. There's again this heat, this fear. This is a kind of intense and dangerous place. And then as we get the stanza break, we have a kind of slight focus change, which starts to replicate his bewilderment. If you are bewildered, you are stopped, you are confused, you are kind of, really wondering what on earth you're doing. And in bewilderment, then he almost stopped. So we've got this kind of running and then stopping, like he's having another moment of, what am I doing here? And this moment of reflection and contemplation, that was the word I was looking for earlier, then kind of takes it to an almost kind of clinical examination of how on earth did I get here? So we've got this kind of relationship between an individual and fate. And he's thinking, on a cosmic level, on the level of this kind of international stage, why am I involved? And if the minute you talk about clockwork, that consonance, the repetition of the consonant harsh K sound kind of is mimicking that clockwork, cold clockwork of the stars. This idea that this is a mechanism, this is a process or a procedure, it doesn't care about him. That A kind of is mimicking the emotional coldness. There is nothing that cares about him at this moment. He is just a hand pointing as part of this machine. It's the thing he's facing. And he's saying, how did I get here? How am I a piece in this particular machine being aimed in this direction at this particular moment? And it's only here with that question and the uncertainty that it represents that we get to the end of that first sentence. And, you've got the, I suppose, the total and absolutely all-consuming awareness of the physical danger that he's in, contrasted with the kind of near philosophical contemplation for how did this happen at that moment. And then again, we start, he was running. Okay, so we've got that echo from here, that repetition. This is all he can do at this moment. He was running. And again, that line break, giving the blank space. Where's he running to? Well, he's running and he runs. We've got these two words on the end of a line, and that is actually a technique called polyptoton, which is where you use the same root in different forms, right? You repeat the same word, but in different forms. And he's running like a man so simile, who's jumped up in the dark and runs listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running. So this entire image is one of instinctive danger. This is somebody who's woken up in the dark, and all of the stuff that the darkness represents on a primitive level to humanity. And you just know instinctively you're in danger, so you run. And between the kind of noises of your footsteps, you're trying to listen for why you're running. So he's acting entirely on instinct. And that is a very, very far cry from the patriotism and the kind of thought and the ideals and the principles that he's been able to indulge when he hasn't been under attack. So again, there's this implicit juxtaposition of he had all the time in the world to think philosophically, but when it comes down to it, wow, it's all instinct and action. And his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. So, time is being distorted here. If we're working on a sort of cosmic level, he's almost able to kind of be examining the idea of what's chasing me, what am I running from in the perceived kind of moments between his feet hitting the ground. And he feels like, he's just stopping like a statuary in mid-stride. Okay. And then again, we have that caesura, and then the action comes back in brutally with then the I can't say it, shot, slashed furrows through up a yellow hair. So in this moment of him kind of having that sense of, what am I doing? Where am I even going? All of a sudden, if you imagine it's like a movie when it's kind of slowed down and slowed down and slowed down, and then all of a sudden, bang, it's back in it. They turn the sound back up, and you've got the action kind of kicking back in again, as multicolored and as loud as the director can make it. And a furrow is those kind of gaps in the ground that you get when you plow. If you think of a machine going up and down to put little V shapes in for seed. So nature has become unnatural. These furrows, they are meant to be there for seed. They're meant to be there for that, planting and harvesting and creating stuff. And yet it is, a field which is meant to be used ultimately for harvest, where the furrows have been made by shot slashes. This is a distorted version of nature, and it only becomes more distorted when the earth starts to kind of reject or throw out or something what's happened to the animals there. Now, I had a conversation with a student recently about the fact that one of her teachers had said that this was a metaphorical hare. It's not actually a literal hare. I think I read it both ways. I'm prepared, to have the point put to me that it's not a real hare. But I think, the horror and the, awful reality of, this violence is so all-consuming that it's distorting. It's kind of got this grotesque parody of what the natural world is meant to be like. If you're talking about a grotesque parody, by the way, grotesque is a kind of horrible, distorted, ugly version of something. And a parody is where you do an impression of something or you mimic it. So a grotesque parody is this kind of horrible, awful impression of something. And if we take it that, the yellow hare rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, threshing is when you are, you're collecting in the corn, you're stomping it down. So the hare is like a fire and it's crawling rather than jumping, which is unnatural. And it's in a threshing circle, which is usually a positive thing of harvest and plenty and positivity, and a circle that it can't go anywhere. And, it's rolling round, obviously in agony or pain or so. It's mouth wide. And again, you've got that kind of, it's mouth wide. Wow, look at all of that blank space there before you flick through the enjambment and you go wide open, silent. So, this horrible image of this silent scream from the hare, its eyes standing out, finish. You have that kind of slightly shorter line just to pause for a moment for that, brutality of that image and the surprise of it. All of a sudden, this can't get any worse. Wow, look at this thing. It's almost, do not use the phrase jump scare in your essay, but we can understand between us that it is a jump scare. And the effect of that is to create this idea of speed and violence. He plunged past with his bayonet, that plosive alliteration there. He's no longer stumbling. He's no longer running. He's now plunging. If you want to talk about the progression of those verbs, right? With his bayonet towards the green hedge. So it's not a sanctuary, we do this idea that he's running towards. And we have this listing of king, honor, human dignity. And they kind of de-escalate, this is really, wow, the king, my honor, just basic dignity. It's all dismissed by that, etc. Okay, that's the long version of what you normally see written like that. So king, honor, human dignity, etc. Whatever, dropped like luxuries, simile. Okay, a luxury is something that you indulge yourself in, that you've got to really kind of you've got to have the the time or the money or the stuff to really have a luxury. It's not a necessity, and they've gone. All these principles have given way to this yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air. The onomatopoeia there, the blue from earlier, those bullets and the zapping through. Everything is these principles are no longer valued. They've just become completely meaningless. And we've got, he's all he wants to do is, it's that imperative. The air itself is dangerous. And I kind of argue from this final line that his terror has almost become a weapon. There is a volatility to it that means that, the man-weapon dichotomy, the tension there, okay, a dichotomy is that tension or conflict, means that, actually now he is the weapon. He is the thing that's going to explode or be destroyed or do the destruction, because dynamite, has that potential for complete destruction. And if his terror is a touchy dynamite, it has got that instability about it. He's abandoned all thought of patriotism in favor of survival. And actually, he has given himself over to that instinct to survive, but within a natural world, which is now horribly distorted, where everything is mixed up between man-made violence and the kind of, now grotesque natural world. Hedges are dazzling with rifle fire. threshing circles are made of kind of burning rabbits or burning hares. This is a whole kind of subverted world, and that has been the consequence of conflict. The only other thing I would look at is I would start to look at the form of it. It is free verse. I'm just trying to look. I don't think there's really a kind of rhyme scheme or so. So if you're talking about free verse, there is the unpredictability of it. There is the kind of sense that you now can't rely on it. Anything can come from anywhere. It's something that you've been robbed of the regularity of any sense of predictability or structure. If you can, blend in your form and structure points with your analysis. So, if you're choosing a quotation, say a lot about a little. Don't just say, oh, this is a metaphor and it has connotations of. Talk about the alliteration, talk about, the layers, talk about the bigger themes, talk about, monosyllables or something, or the assonance on certain consonants to give you that kind of building up effect. If you're writing a longer essay on it, try and blend in, the form and structure. If you forget form and structure, yes, put a paragraph in at the end that says, in terms of form and structure, Hughes uses enjambment or end stop or long sentences or free verse, and always give the effect. But better, and to get kind of 7 or above at GCSE, you're always integrating, right? Because that's where the higher grades lie. Hopefully that's helped. Do what you can. I think this is a really good and yet horrible poem. So hopefully that all makes sense. And good luck with whatever you're doing.